Hello, classroom. How are you? This is the teacher. This is the reading room. And we are here for day number 9. We skipped day number 9 yesterday. So, because we had a special on our DIY Psychologist, you should check it out. It was really good. So we're starting here with day 9, chapter 8. In our book by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, Ethics for a New Millennium. The Ethic of Compassion. Chapter 8, the Ethic of Compassion. We noted earlier that all the world's major religions stress the importance. Okay. Disconnected, reconnected. We noted earlier that all the world's major religions stress the importance of cultivating love and compassion. In the Buddhist philosophical tradition, different levels of attainment are described. At a basic level, compassion, Nyingje, is understood mainly in terms of empathy, our ability to enter into and, to some extent, share others' suffering. But Buddhists and perhaps others believe that this can be developed to such a degree that not only does our compassion arise without any effort, but it is unconditional, undifferentiated, and universal in scope. A feeling of intimacy toward all other sentient beings, including, of course, those who would harm us, is generated, which is likened in the literature to the love a mother has for her only child. But this sense of equanimity toward all others is not seen as an end in itself. Rather, it is seen as a springboard to a love still greater. Because our capacity for empathy is innate, and because the ability to reason is also an innate faculty, compassion shares the characteristics of consciousness itself. The potential we have to develop it is therefore stable and continuous. It is not a resource which can be used up as water is used up when we boil it. And though it can be described in terms of activity, it is not like a physical activity which we train for, like jumping where once we reach a certain height, we can go no further. On the contrary, when we enhance our sensitivity toward others' suffering through deliberately opening ourselves up to it, it is believed that we can gradually extend our compassion to the point where the individual feels so moved by even the subtlest suffering of others that they come to have an overwhelming sense of responsibility toward those others. This causes the one who is compassionate to dedicate themselves entirely to helping others overcome both their suffering and the causes of their suffering. In Tibetan, this ultimate level of attainment is called Nyingje Kenmo, literally great compassion. Now, I'm not suggesting that each individual must attain these advanced states of spiritual development in order to lead an ethically wholesome life. I have described Nyingje Kenmo not because it is a precondition of ethical conduct, but rather because I believe that pushing the logic of compassion to the highest level can act as a powerful inspiration. If we can just keep the aspiration to develop Nyingje Kenmo, or great compassion, as an ideal, it will naturally have a significant impact on our outlook. It feels like there's nothing in the American business that has compassion whatsoever. Seems like the opposite of compassion is corporation. Based on the simple recognition that just as I do, so do all others desire to be happy and not suffer, it will serve as a constant reminder against selfishness and partiality. It will remind us that if we receive ethical conduct for those whom we feel close to, if we reserve ethical conduct for those we are close to, the danger is that we will neglect our responsibility towards those outside this circle. It will remind us that there is little to be gained from being kind and generous because we hope to win something in return. It will remind us that actions motivated by the desire to create a good name for ourselves are still selfish, however much they may appear to be acts of kindness. It will also remind us that there is nothing exceptional about acts of charity toward those we already feel close to, and it will help us to recognize that the bias we naturally feel toward our families and friends is actually a highly unreliable thing on which to base ethical conduct. Why is this? So long as the individuals in question continue to meet our expectations, all is well. But should they fail to do so, someone we consider a dear friend one day can become our sworn enemy the next. As we saw earlier, we have a tendency to react badly to all who threaten fulfillment of our cherished desires, though they may be our closest relatives. For this reason, compassion and mutual respect offer a much more solid basis for our relations with others. This is also true of partnerships. Likewise, if our love for someone is based largely on attraction, whether it be their looks or some other superficial characteristic, our feelings for that person are liable over time to evaporate. When they lose the quality we find alluring, or when we find ourselves no longer satisfied with it or by it, the situation can change completely. This despite there being the same person. This is why relationships based purely on attraction are almost always unstable. On the other hand, when we begin to perfect our compassion, neither the other's appearance nor their behavior affects our underlying attitude. Consider, too, that habitually our feelings toward others depend very much on their circumstances. Most people, when they see someone who is handicapped, feel sympathetic toward that person. But then when they see others who are wealthier or better educated or better placed socially, they immediately feel envious and competitive toward them. Our negative feelings prevent us from seeing the sameness of ourselves and all others. We forget that just like, whether fortunate or unfortunate, distant or near, they desire to be happy and not to suffer. The struggle is thus to overcome these feelings of partiality. Certainly, developing genuine compassion for our loved ones is the obvious and appropriate place to start. The impact our actions have on our close ones will generally be much greater than on others, and therefore our responsibilities towards them are no grounds for discriminating in their favor. In this sense, we are all in the same position as a doctor confronted by 10 patients suffering the same illness. They are each equally deserving of treatment. The reader should not suppose that what is being advocated here is a state of detached indifference, however. The further essential challenge as we begin to extend our compassion toward all others is to maintain the same level of intimacy as we feel toward those closest to us. In other words, what is being suggested is that we need to strive for even-handedness in our approach toward all others, a level ground into which we can plant the seed of Nyingje Kenmo, of great love and compassion. If we can begin to relate to others on the basis of such equanimity, and compassion will not depend on the fact that so-and-so is my husband, my wife, my relative, my friend. Rather, a feeling of closeness toward others can be developed based on the simple recognition that, just like myself, all wish to be happy and to avoid suffering. In other words, we will start to relate to others on the basis of their sentiment nature. Again, we think of this in terms of the ideal, one in which it is immensely difficult to attain. But for myself, I find it one which is profoundly inspiring and helpful. Let us now consider the role of compassionate love and kind-heartedness in our daily lives. Does the ideal of developing it to the point where it is unconditional mean that we must abandon our own interests entirely? Not at all. In fact, it is the best way of serving them. Indeed, it could even be said to constitute the wisest course for fulfilling self-interest. For if it is correct that those qualities such as love, patience, tolerance, and forgiveness are what happiness consists of, and if it is also correct that Nying J, or compassion, as I have defined it, is both the source and the fruit of these qualities, then the more we are compassionate, the more we provide for our own happiness. Thus, an idea that concern for others, though a noble quality, is a matter for our private lives only, is simply short-sighted. Compassion belongs to every sphere of activity, including, of course, the workplace. Here, though, I must acknowledge the existence of a perception shared by many, it seems, that compassion is not, if not actually, an impediment, at least irrelevant to professional life. Personally, I would argue that not only is it relevant, but that when compassion is lacking, our activities are in danger of becoming destructive. This is because when we ignore the question of the impact our actions have on others' well-being, inevitably we end up hurting them. Johnson & Johnson. The ethic of compassion helped provide the necessary foundation and motivation for both restraint and the cultivation of virtue. When we begin to develop a genuine appreciation of the value of compassion, our outlook on others begins automatically to change. You should be ashamed of yourself, Joaquin Duato, coming from an Asian background, that you have no concept of the harm that you're doing in general. Or maybe you do and you just don't care who you're harming. You don't care about the people you're harming. The ethic of, which isn't compassionate, by the way. The ethic of compassion helps provide the necessary foundations for motivation for both restraint and the cultivation of virtue. When we begin to develop a genuine appreciation of the value of compassion, our outlook on others begins automatically to change. This alone can serve as a powerful influence on the conduct of our lives. When, for example, the temptation to deceive others arises, our compassion for them will prevent us from entertaining the idea. And that's deceive others. It's not even to harm them or hurt them like you have been, McLaren. And when we realize that our work itself is in danger of being exploited to the detriment of others, compassion will cause us to disengage from it. Disengage, J&J. All right. So to take an imaginary case of a scientist whose research seems likely to be a source of suffering, they will recognize this and act accordingly, even if this means abandoning the project. Not our scientists here. I do not deny that genuine problems can arise when we dedicate ourselves to the ideal of compassion. In the case of a scientist who felt unable to continue in the direction their work was taking them, this could have profound consequences both for themselves and for their families. Likewise, those engaged in the caring professions in medicine, counseling, social work, and so on, or even those looking for someone at home, may sometimes become so exhausted by their duties that they feel overwhelmed. Constant exposure to suffering, coupled occasionally with the feeling of being taken for granted, can induce feelings of helplessness and even despair. Or it can happen that individuals may find themselves performing outwardly. Solution, it is rather the ultimate failure. That's the reason why I disengaged. Hold on, no data. Okay, back again. That's the reason why I disengaged since March, right? So I'm sorry that hopefully that you didn't miss much on that, but I'm going to keep going. Let's see here. I'll go up here. Or it can happen that individuals may find themselves performing outwardly generous actions merely for the sake of it, simply going through the motions, as it were. Of course, this is better than nothing, but when left unchecked, this can lead to insensitivity towards others' suffering. If this starts to happen, it is best to disengage for a short while and make a deliberate effort to reawaken the sensitivity. And that's what I started to say. That's what I did in March. I had to reawaken the sensitivity. It is rather the ultimate In this case, it can be helpful to remember that despair is never a solution. It is rather the ultimate failure. Therefore, as the Tibetan expression has it, even if the rope breaks 9 times, we must splice it back together a 10th time. In this way, even if ultimately we do fail, at least there will be no feelings of regret. What was the rope for? And when we combine this insight with the clear appreciation of our potential to benefit others, we find that we can begin to restore our hope and confidence. Some people may object to this ideal on the grounds that by entering into other suffering, we bring suffering on ourselves. To an extent, this is true, but I suggest that there is an important qualitative distinction to be made between experiencing one's own suffering and experiencing suffering in the course of sharing in others. In the case of one's own suffering, given then it is involuntary, there is a sense of oppression. It seems to come from outside. By contrast, sharing in someone else's suffering must at some level involve a degree of voluntariness, which itself is indicative of a certain inner strength. For this reason, the disturbance it may cause is considerably less likely to paralyze us than our own suffering. Of course, even as an ideal, the notion of developing an unconditional compassion is daunting. Most people, including myself, must struggle even to reach the point where putting others' interest on par with our own becomes easy. We should not allow this to put us off, however. And while undoubtedly there will be obstacles on the way to developing a genuinely warm heart, there is the deep consolation of knowing that in doing so, we are creating the conditions for our own happiness. As I mentioned earlier, the more we truly desire to benefit others, the greater the strength and confidence we develop, and the greater the peace and happiness we experience. If this still seems unlikely, it is worth asking ourselves how else we are to do so. With violence and aggression? Of course not. With money? Perhaps up to a point, but no further. But with love, by sharing in others' suffering, by recognizing ourselves clearly in all others, especially those who are disadvantaged and those whose rights are not respected, by helping them to be happy, yes. Through love, through kindness, through compassion, we establish understanding between ourselves and others. This is how we forge unity and harmony. Compassion and love are not mere luxuries. As the source both of inner and external peace, they are fundamental to the continued survival of our species. On the one hand, they can constitute nonviolence in action. On the other, they are the source of all spiritual qualities of forgiveness, tolerance, and all the virtues. Moreover, they are the very thing that gives meaning to our activities and makes them constructive. There is nothing amazing about being highly educated. There is nothing amazing about being rich. Only when the individual has a warm heart do these attributes become worthwhile. So to those who say that the Dalai Lama is being unrealistic in advocating this ideal of unconditional love, I urge them to experiment with it nonetheless. They will discover that when we reach beyond the confines of narrow self-interest, our hearts become filled with strength. Peace and joy become our constant companion. It breaks down barriers of every kind and in the end destroys the notion of my interest as independent from others' interest. But most important, so far as ethics is concerned, where love is one neighbor, affection, kindness, and compassion live, we find that ethical conduct is automatic. Ethically wholesome actions arise naturally in the context of compassion. We just finished chapter 8, boys and girls. We're on to chapter 9. That'll be on day number 10, however. So, that was a great accomplishment, I thought. We are reading in the reading room the book Ethics for a New Millennium by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. we are done with our 3 days on. We are back to our 4 days off. If you don't know what to do with yourself on your 4 days off, there's the VIA that we talked about in our DIY classroom. And by the way, we talked about talents and early birds and gave them a whole bunch of stuff to do. So if you don't know what to do, well, take a look over here at something we did in the early birds. The blue, over the other way, bring up the other way. There we go. The blue heart there, and about our talents, and the red heart over here. That's what we did. I don't know what this is. Right there and right there. We did those in early birds this morning. So activities abound. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room on day 155 of the classroom. And I will see you next Tuesday. Thanks for joining me. Enjoy the sunshine here in Michigan.